and good morning in Washington, D.C. My name is Christine Beidzinga, and I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I work on U.S. defense and transatlantic security, and I know this is a topic that many of you have been following over the past weeks and months, and it has been a very dynamic week on U.S. security and foreign policy. This is a webinar where we're going to be looking at the various new policy drops and the evolution of American security and defense policy from Europe. This webinar is being recorded, so any comments that you might put in the discussion will be available on the record. We're incredibly excited that you're joining us today, and we'd love to have your engagement and your questions shape the course of this webinar. We have activated the Q&A function, which is on the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to put in your questions, and we'll be addressing them throughout the webinar and especially at the end to make sure that your questions are addressed. Today's lessons learned are going to focus on the European dimension. The U.S. foreign and security policy is tremendously important for European security, but security also more broadly. We've seen in the last week that the Trump administration has dropped its national security strategy. This document, released a week ago, has shaken up the transatlantic partners. On the one hand, Europe gets a lot of attention. On the other hand, the tone is not what many Europeans would have desired. At the same time, Congress is releasing its National Defense Authorization Act. This legislation passed last night by the House has a very different tone on transatlantic relations, NATO affairs, and Europe. And this can be confusing. To make sense of all of this, I have three amazing colleagues with me today who will be telling us what to worry about, what to pay attention to, and what maybe is less important overall. My colleagues are first, Dr. Carrie Lee on the transatlantic security team. She's a civil military expert and has extensive experience in the academic and military space in the United States. I am joined by Philip Bednarczyk. Phil is our Warsaw director who has also have extensive experience working in Congress on the House side. And this is a deep wealth of knowledge that you on this webinar can tap into. And last but not least, I have Dr. Ian Lesser, who is a distinguished fellow in our Brussels office and has extensive experience in Europe, on the Mediterranean, in the transatlantic field, in Washington, and can pull together the European dimension, what this feels like in Brussels, in NATO, at the EU, and what it means for the path ahead. So as we kick this off, I'd like to have a sense, Carrie, from you first. You've been the closest to these strategies in the past. Can you tell us a bit about what is the most important thing we have seen in the last week from these strategies?
So I'm going to point to two big ideas first. The first is that there are very clearly divisions within the United States government about what the future of the United States should be regarding its involvement in Europe. Um, we have divisions within the Trump administration and within the White House, although one particular side has been expressed kind of through the national security strategy and the language of the national security strategy. And then you have a Republican-controlled Congress, but a Congress that feels very differently about U.S. engagement with Europe and the role of Europe. Where most of the Republican Party and other parts of the government right now agree is that Europe should be doing more burden sharing and should be taking up more um, should be taking more ownership of their defense. However, the tenor of that relationship, the degree to which the U.S. should disengage entirely, is a matter of kind of intense political discussion and deep divisions within the Republican Party and the US government more generally. And I think these two documents really signify that. It's very rare for you to have so much daylight between the tone, tenor, and intent expressed in a national security strategy, and then immediately following a piece of legislation, which is legally binding in the United States, that really puts roadblocks in the way of the administration from enacting that strategy. That's quite rare, especially when you have unified government in the United States where the Republicans are controlling House, Senate, and White House. Um, the the tone of the NSS, I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't start off these remarks by saying that, a national security strategy is rarely an actual strategy in the classic sense that we think about like meeting ends, ways, and means, but it is a very good indication of, in this administration at least, how a certain section of the administration sees the world. And so it is a grand strategic document and it is a theory of security that deals a lot with migration, that deals a lot with sort of domestic political challenges, that thinks about demographic changes across the world as security challenges. And that is very different from how the United States has traditionally thought about its security and security threats. It's going to take some huge adjustment, both domestically and internationally, and should and will have reverberations across Europe.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I think you're pulling on strands here of very deep feelings and commitments to Europe in Washington, and yet a lot of discord over what direction that relationship could take. Phil, could you jump in next on what you think the main takeaways are here, and how do we interpret the two different veins of argumentation over what is the future of the U.S. security relationship with Europe?
Sure, sure. Thank you, Christine, and good to see everybody. As Christine mentioned, I'm fairly new to the GMF and fairly new to Poland, so if you're in Warsaw, do swing by. It's been a pleasure working on these issues from a different place, out a little bit off the beaten path outside of Congress, for now. When I think about the NDAA, and I'm going to maybe dim some of the daylight that Kerry shined between the two documents. When I think about the NDA, I think of this slow, deliberative, long negotiated process, which is an accumulation of years of negotiation of different things, and almost a Christmas tree of opportunities because it's a must-pass piece of legislation, which is unique in Congress and an opportunity for members from across the U.S. to add different spokes to this legislation that reflects sometimes local concerns, smaller concerns, or things that are foreign affairs, national security adjacent. It also reflects a broad consensus in Congress. Given all those things, and when I saw the language that came out over thousands of pages, I didn't read the whole NDA this year, but I'm familiar with a lot of the sections and the forms and formats. A lot of my classic the transatlanticism and transatlanticist in me, all those isms did tangle a little bit, and I did make me feel better about the situation in general after reading the NSS. When I looked at some of the things, including mandatory Russia reporting, Russia as a threat, support for Ukraine in a few different ways. But when thinking about this, combined with the NSS and timing in general with the negotiations with Russia to end Russia's war in Ukraine, somehow square that circle. Plus General Kellogg's departure from the negotiations next year, I poured a little bit of cold water on this NDAA document. The other thing I will say, three things, is we're thinking about the Ukraine question and the politics behind that. The three things that stood out, like, where is Ukraine important for this broad political consensus? Then you start thinking about the abducted Ukrainian children, which is also a part of somewhere in the negotiations as well. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, also part of the negotiations as well so far. Let's see where that lands. And military support for Ukraine, which still exists via an older program, USAI. Not to the degree that we saw during the last administration with the supplemental billions of dollars in mil support, but still exists, and that's a signal that should resonate a little bit, and not to change the battlefield, but it's kind of sets some of the pieces that we'll talk about later for the next few months, a critical next few months, whether or not the NSS is used as a template on a daily basis. But for the next few months, we could kind of see some of the guidelines for where Congress and these pools of power could work together in Washington with help or whatever, with a push here and there from our allies and other partners and interest groups from across the world. I'll stop there because before I get too much into the politics. Thank you, Christine.
We'll get into the weeds here, but Phil, as we just set the landscape here, we had the National Security Strategy passed last week. This is a political vision, a grand strategy document, as Carrie was saying, for the administration. And the NDAA you just called a must pass bill. We see this in a lot of the press, but as someone with so much experience on the Hill, can you explain to our European audiences in particular, what does that mean?
That means, well, you have sometimes false deadlines, but they exist, and then this behemoth of a piece of legislation will pass. So that's reflected in the negotiations, what's included or not, pressures from the White House administration, from interest groups. It's also an opportunity from other folks, as I mentioned, if you could make an argument for the legal template that your bill your idea. I'm thinking about the Development Finance Corporation, other things that you might not think of in the traditional national security sense, or even policies on regions, whether it be the Balkans, Black Sea strategy. This kind of comes into this large document. So all that must pass bill, which not many exist in Congress, give that the momentum behind to push this across the finish line. And a lot of that has to do with the defense and the kind of the culture and thinking here in Congress that we would never not pass this authorization bill, which authorizes all these actions, and that provides the momentum that whatever's in this at the end of the day, it will most likely get the votes, which we saw this week.
Thank you so much for the clarification. Because we do throw a lot of words around here in the different policy bubbles, and they don't necessarily land the same way in each capital. Ian, over to you. What is important about this from the lens of Brussels, from the lens of having spent so much time on both sides of the Atlantic and the policy communities?
Christine, thank you very much. Good to be with you. Sitting in Brussels, it's an interesting time to be watching all of this. I'm actually sitting in Morocco today, so I don't know what that says. But in any case, just mention a couple of things that you can imagine the intensity of the interest in this over the last days. And I think it centers around a couple of different things. Some of them have been mentioned already. I mean, one thing that I think was very clear, and most of this was about the National Security Strategy document, because the defense authorization piece hadn't really been part of the debate until today. First thing, it reinforces a lot of existing anxieties and concerns in Europe. None of this was entirely new. There are pieces in there about economic competitiveness. There are pieces in there that concern Europe's ability to defend itself in the future with less America. The burden sharing piece of this, which there is a lot of that in the document, was in a sense, I think, priced into a lot of European thinking already. The idea that Europe should have to pay more and do more, that wasn't entirely surprising to anybody. I think what was particularly striking and most controversial was the political part, the ideological part, the references to civilizational decline in Europe and the American interest in reversing this, a sense that somehow Europe is emblematic of all the things that you don't want in the world. And, obviously, it wouldn't surprise you that Europeans have focused on this. The official reaction has been relatively muted, I would say, critical but muted. The sort of debate reaction in the public at large, obviously much less so. But a lot of it was about the style and the ideology. You could even see echoes here of the Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference the last time, where he talked quite directly about these civilizational, cultural issues in a way that made a lot of Europeans uncomfortable. By the way, there will clearly be elements on the hard right in Europe who will find some of this reassuring. But, that's part of it. Just a quick word on how the NDAA is likely to be read. I think obviously it's going to be a counterpoint that will be reassuring to many who were worried about the United States simply disengaging from European security. I think there's a very important question. I'll just put it down to end and leave it there about how you could imagine that the U.S. strategic nuclear umbrella still would function without a significant US tripwire on the European continent. I don't think it would. And the fact that this defense authorization sets limits to that kind of disengagement, I think will be reassuring to many in Europe. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Ian. So we have a lot of concrete policy uh, elements being suggested. We have an overarching difference in tones coming from Congress as well as the administration on engagement with Europe on security and defense matters. It's really important for our audience to understand what is concretely going to come out of both of these sides. And so I want to drill down a little bit about what's going to be the thing that remains from the national security strategy, which, unlike the NDAA, is not legally binding. It is a policy vision, it is politically significant, and yet there is no mandatory binding checklist that comes out of it. The NDAA is a legally binding checklist, but that also depends upon enforcement. So you have these different tools and different visions. So what, in your opinion, if you're going to drill down one or two most important things that we will see implemented coming from one or the other of these, could you lay those out? And maybe, Carrie, I'll go back to you. What's going to remain? What do you think is going to be on our minds for the next few years that came out of these new policy drops?
So the thing that the administration has actually been quite unified about, and that I would expect to be long lasting, is the focus on the Western Hemisphere. That has been a consistent message that's come out of the administration. The Department of Defense seems to be on board with this. The most kind of more powerful elements within the administration are very enthusiastic about this mission. And so the US pivot to focus on the Western Hemisphere and which is quite novel for the United States. And if you talk to colleagues inside the Department of Defense who have traditionally rotated through Southcom, the U.S. Southern Command, and other folks, they're very excited about their budgets. um, but so that I think is going to stick. I would also expect the politics of the NSS to stick as long as those who are interested in those particular kind of discussions about Western civilization and the Anglosphere, right, are remain in power. So I would expect much more U.S. commentary on European domestic politics. And potentially some political leverage and much more kind of US meddling in European domestic politics than we are used to, and that we have traditionally come to expect from the United States. The third thing that I'm looking at very closely is this Russia reporting requirement that Phil mentioned at the top. I'm very interested to see who inside the Department of Defense is given that task, to see how seriously the DoD is taking it. Historically, right, the Department of Defense sees Russia as a real security challenge, not just for its actions in Europe, but across the world, right? Its growing alliance and relationship with China, its already pre-existing relationships with Iran and with India and with other countries around the world that we consider to be super problematic and present real security challenges to the United States and its allies across the globe. And so I'm looking to see how seriously the DoD takes the reporting requirement that's in the NDAA and how much it uses that to try and push back against some of the much softer language in the national security strategy on Russia that really sees. I was very surprised in the NSS, right, about the description of strategic stability on the European continent as one that appears to be the Europeans' fault. And one reading of that would say that, strategic stability is actually a problem the US has to solve with Europe, as opposed to solve by addressing the menace of Russia. And so that's a lot of daylight between how the Department of Defense has traditionally thought about Russia versus how the administration is thinking about its approach to Russia. And so what happens with that reporting requirement, I'll be paying close attention to.
Thank you so much. And I think you're right to bring up that daylight between the two policies on what Russia is as an overarching strategic question. And there's tremendous differences between this national security strategy and Biden's, and actually Trump 1's national security strategy, which specifically draw attention to the threats that Russia poses. And in Trump 1, the efforts to wedge apart the United States from its European allies was highlighted as a major concern. And yet now, in the NSS, it's the Europeans who have the concern with Russia and no Russia language in and of itself. Phil, what do you see as the thing that is going to be there at every turn for the next few years coming out of these two policy drops?
Yeah, Carrie took a bit about what I would like to say about Russia, but I'm happy to go a little bit further on that point because I see like in the incongruencies between the NDAA and the NSS. Like what are the clashes next if they do become clashes between Congress and the administration in a changing political atmosphere, a midterm election year next year? I think we're maybe talking about that later. So when you see the administration, first off, has a lot of leeway in this foreign affairs, national security space to determine. The NDAA requires them to do a bit. It could be reporting, it could be checks on certain on troop movements, absolutely. But when I think about the language and actions when it comes to China, some of the China questions and the politics that exist in Congress and in the country, and the attempt at a Russia reset. Kerry mentioned strategic stability, that's normalization, even some of the business ideas that are being floated around with or without the use of Russian frozen assets in Europe. That is a direct clash between some of the traditional broad consensus-based views on Russia as an adversary, which it is to what how we define life in our democracy and in our alliance. Support for Ukraine, broadly speaking, is still popular in the U.S. Support for NATO and the alliance and the U.S. presence and leadership in the alliance is broadly popular in the U.S. And if the administration continues to push again and may perhaps in a changing political space next year, will Congress decide to use some of its power, which is written into law, but even more so when it comes to oversight and questioning and more legislation. And don't forget the Magnitsky Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation and when it comes to human rights. Related to the Sergei Magnitsky story in Russia that came from Congress against the administration's will, I believe under Obama back then. So like Congress, if decides to, and it's written out in the NDA, if it decides to, can stop up and say, wait, not so fast, not so fast with this in this case the normalization with Russia, and that's then and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Ian's point about Vice President Vance's Munich speech, but in Poland, these things rhyme with President Trump's speech in his visit to Warsaw, also when he mentioned some of the civilizational ideas. So, like a lot of these things are not new ideas that shouldn't shock us, but here we are. What does that mean? Are we civilizational partners with Moscow? Question mark. Thank you.
And you brought up Ukraine in particular. So, with Ukraine policy, is there something in the NSS that isn't just vibes and tone, but that really changes the administration's outlook or draws red lines about Ukraine's role in the future?
If that's to me, I don't think the NSS is the defining document for the negotiations, the fast moving negotiations where the pieces are being defined as we speak. I do, having spent the last few days in DC, I do get a sense, even when I talk about congressional pushback or even like the conversation with the administration and other Europeans are in town, I have a feeling that and there is sort of an encouragement to the Ukrainians to be comfortable. It's tough to say to put the burden on them to be comfortable with not accepting a bad deal. And I do think that President Zelensky is in a good enough place to not have to be pressured into accepting a bad deal in his definition. And we'll see if the Europeans are able to support what that would mean for Ukraine, despite efforts to normalize relations with Moscow from Washington.
Carrie, do you
So,
want to jump in
Christine,
on that?
I see,
yeah,
Carrie.
I'll to use an American metaphor, I'll take your fastball over the plate. Um, and mention the sort of elephant in the NSS when it comes to European security, which is the closed door for NATO, right? I think this was really interesting, and it was a huge part of Russian narrative, right, around the war in Ukraine that Ukraine can't, and their invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine can't join NATO, and now the administration is essentially giving that away, right, through its political signaling by writing down in the document that and in their political strategy that NATO is a closed door. We will have no new members, and it goes against 70 plus years of NATO policy and the sort of foundation of the organization that has always had an open door towards members that can meet its criteria and participate in collective, European and transatlantic security. So I don't know how well this will land, right, with other sections of the government that are going to be responsible for helping to enact this policy. But it is a very strong signal from the president and other members of the administration that they are much more sympathetic to the Russian narrative of this and of like what kind of Russia's own security concerns and are willing to make big concessions, politically at least, in order to achieve this thing that they're calling strategic stability, which I will add is not the traditional understanding of what like security specialists would call strategic stability.
No. Christine,
Ian,
I,
please
oh,
jump
no,
in on
sorry.
that.
Go ahead. If I might just come in on that, because I mean, these are a series of really interesting points. I think, Carrie, I mean, you make a very good point, obviously, about the open door or not. I think actually how that will be read in Europe is actually quite nuanced because there is, let's be realistic. There has been a lot of sort of diplomatic pretense about what people would really like in this regard. I mean, the skepticism, the doubts about future NATO enlargement are not just in Washington. Obviously, they're more widely shared within NATO. I don't think anyone or very few countries would want to go as far as the document does to shut the door, but they're not keen either. And so it would be interesting to see how that would be read. I do think there's another point here worth making, which is that the document, sets out a very clear, just reading it as a whole, difference in perspective on Ukraine between Washington and Brussels. For Washington, forgive me, just looking at it from abroad, this is a problem to be taken off the table, to move on, to get a secure diplomatic success, the nuance, the parameters of the actual settlement of a deal, perhaps of less concern. Now, that's maybe not realistic, but I think that's kind of where the administration would like to go. I think in Brussels, almost everyone is very, very focused, well, on getting a ceasefire, sure, but also, what does this mean for the future relationship of Europe with an aggressive Russia? And that's what's missing in this document for a lot of people. On the other hand, the NDA probably in that regard would be more reassuring. But I would also go back, if I may, just at the end to your very first point, Carrie, which is that all that attention to the Western Hemisphere, other things, Europe is in a way quite far down the list in that table of contents in that NSF. And I think that would get a lot of attention too.
When we look at what remains, and Ian, if we can stay with you on that, what about policies on the Western Hemisphere or on China? What should Europeans be looking at in terms of what's going to remain in the non-European basket that might really matter for the Europeans too?
Well, I think one of the very clear messages, I'm sitting here in Morocco now, people are talking about this, if there are places that are to be left, in a sense, to others to manage, clearly the Middle East, North Africa, these are on the list. And if you were looking at this from the point of view of Turkey, for example, we just did a short analysis on this at GMF. There's a lot to like in this document from a Turkish point of view. There's a lot also to be concerned about. And clearly there is a sense that a lot of the regional security management is going to be devolved to others. When it comes to the Western Hemisphere, this is a place where Europe is looking to consolidate its relations, in part for trade reasons, Mercosur and other things. this is an area where there are big disagreements about how to handle Venezuela or Cuba or other things. It's not a popular thing, including the rule of law issues that come into play with some of the military action that's been taken. Um, it doesn't. You don't get a lot of points in Europe for what's happening in the Caribbean these days.
Thank you. I want to pull in a question we have, and thank you so much for writing them in. And Carrie, maybe I'll go to you a bit here on this because there are questions here about the China threat. There are questions about what it means, as you brought up, the lasting focus on the Western Hemisphere, but also a transformation of the language around how this administration and the United States understands the China threat. Uh, Malign influence, cooperation with Russia has often been, and in the NDAA is an issue that is highlighted. But what else is going on here? What is the change, and what should Europeans think about it or do about it?
So after a decade or more of the United States pushing Europe to think more about China, to see China more as a security threat, to then read a national security strategy that really only talks about China as an economic competitor as opposed to a security challenge is a little bit jarring, right? And I use this kind of euphemistically. Like I was shocked because there's no mention in the national security strategy of China's nuclear modernization. There's no mention in the national security strategy of Chinese aggression and interests in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, right? It talks about Taiwan, but purely as an economic stability issue rather than as a values issue or a democracy issue or even a sovereignty issue, right? Which is also all over the national security strategy. So it's a very different framing of the security challenges that the United States has been pressing Europe to think about and think about more seriously. Um, what does this mean? I don't know yet. And I would caution Europe, like European leaders and others, from reading too much into the national security strategy. This is one area where I think we really need to wait for the national defense strategy. Because again, going back to sort of divisions within the administration, the Defense Department and the author or the sort of lead office for the National Defense Strategy is headed by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby. And he has some very well-known views about China that are quite hawkish. And so when you contrast that with what we ended up reading in the NSS, like I will be very interested to see how the National Defense Strategy comes out and the degree to which it talks about China as a standalone security threat to stability in the region, to our allies in the region. Yes, to economic security, but also as a standalone threat to the United States. In the way that we have traditionally thought about it, and increasingly, the Department of Defense especially has been very interested in. So on this, I would say don't look at the NSS for this. The implementation is going to be the devil's in the details with the National Defense Strategy. I expect that to take a very different, not just tone, but concrete actions and be much more of a traditional strategy, matching ends, ways, and means, right? And outlining what those political ends in the South China Sea and along the first and second island chains and all of those kind of strategically important areas. I would say wait for the national defense strategy when thinking about China.
Thank you so much. I think that the political question, reading the political tea leaves, this is something that is not very clear, both perhaps across the United States and across our allies. Phil, how do you see this tension between the administration's approach on the national security strategy, the more traditionalist approach, though focusing also on burden sharing in the NDAA? How do you read these political tea leaves of what is developing in the United States, and what do we see over the next year?
Yeah, indeed, Christine. I think those are just kind of the boundaries of what is could of the possible for next year in the political space, particularly with the midterms looming less than a year away. I think Congress expressed itself in this NDA. Next year's NDA will pass after most likely next year's midterms, and who it may be a different space, but regardless, those pressures and the moving pieces in Congress will already begin to expose themselves as senior members of Congress, or even new folks are trying to read the ground, the political ground in the U.S. And stand out a bit. I think some folks felt a little muted or have been muted a bit with the new administration, giving the new administration leeway to both right the NSS, correct some of the rebalance the relationship with Europe in some ways. There's a lot of spaces where Congress said, okay, let's give President Trump a chance in this space. But I do think like with the calendar moving along, and again, once again to bring up the attempt to normalize relations with Russia, a push for peace in Ukraine, whatever that means, could move some pieces that would push back against in some of those things a little bit too far. And if I may, I made the mistake of going into the Q&A and seeing some questions, but I wanted to tie a question in there. I see a question from Ben Opperman at AOL.com. But he Ben, you mentioned some of the moving pieces with political support for maybe American or Trump support for parties in Europe and what that can mean going forward. And 2026 is a year of a few elections, whether it be regional elections in parts of Europe, some member states, EU member states. And I do think part of the administration will take time to lean in on that front and support. But I would say, don't forget, Ben, like there's a lot of there are a lot of institutional relationships that already exist which you may or folks here may or not be aware of. That's the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. Give that more oxygen. There are good people in that space working on that in that traditional area on economic issues, on the EU, the relationship with the EU, those formal space, and also the NATO Parliamentary Assembly on top of the Senate NATO Observers Group. They're good spaces, and give that oxygen attention. Even members here, and if that make sure that space is safe and attended by good people, but also bring some of those maybe like-minded with certain parts of the Trump administration in that fold, and give them a little responsibility in that space because it's a serious space and it should be given some of that oxygen. Thank you.
Phil, I'm going to draw from our questions that are
Ah,
coming in as well, because someone else is asking whether there is a role for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly or these other assemblies of members of Congress or other legislators across the alliance. Where else can we go next to build these relationships? That's my question. But what is the role of these various formats in this highly dynamic policy space in the transatlantic alliance?
yeah, I mentioned NATO PA and the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. I alluded to the Helsinki Commission, the OSCE PA before with the Magnitsky Act. But speaking of the NDAA and with Helsinki, whether it be not just the traditional EU questions or the big Russia questions, but when you think about the Balkans, the Caucasus, things are even the Baltics, like there are a lot of niche spaces in Congress in Washington, whether it be with think tanks, interest groups, the embassies here that are shaping the policy that goes in the NDA and tracking it on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I could go on for a bit on this, but I'm happy to like help folks help navigate this space when it comes to these nexuses or nexi of attention and power that should be fostered. And it doesn't mean that they're going to define policy or won't be steamrolled by a larger winds or administration whichever way they decide to go. But those are very important spaces that inform upwards. And the OSCPA, as it exists and it's well staffed with good people, it does beautiful work amongst this fray. You know, amongst this, the NSS may keep us up at night for a few days, but there's a lot of good churn going on that I'm happy to point folks towards. Thank you for that opportunity for that fastball.
Ian, I think we have so many questions about what comes next, and we have thought about how we need to really explain to our audiences here what's going on next in the U.S., but also in Europe. And this is going to be a tandem relationship. What are the next steps that we're going to see after these two policy drops? Carrie alluded to the fact that we're not done yet. There's a national defense strategy coming. But what do you think Europe will do next, should do next? What do you expect next from the United States? Please give us a little bit of a forecast.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that easy question, Christine. It's really tough. I mean, I think there's a lot of debate in Europe about how, and it's not new. It didn't start last week about how to respond to the Trump administration's policies, but also the style. And honestly, there is no consensus about that. Different things have been tried, different things are being pursued. There are some sort of broad approaches that I would say are not easy to do, but they're being pursued. For example, on the trade front, looking beyond this overwhelmingly important, admittedly, transatlantic relationship. And by the way, the NSS talks about that. To other fronts, to build new trade agreements in other settings, above all with Mercosur and others. I mean, so you see that with Canada, you see that. You also see something, though, that is very difficult for Europe to fix, which is, and it's very clear in this document, and that is the overwhelmingly bilateral frame in which the administration views Europe. Indeed, not just individual countries, but individual leaderships. That runs counter to a lot of the preferences, especially if you sit in Brussels. The EU is not popular in Washington. Maybe next to the UN, maybe even ahead of the UN. It's an unpopular institution because it embodies all the things the administration, and frankly, many in American official circles don't like. It's slow, it's legalistic, it's ponderous, it's regulatory. It's all those things that philosophically are not popular. But on certain fronts, not least trade, you don't have a choice. You have to deal with the EU. But the EU, between the lines, is the big loser in that document. The other point, I think, and it goes to the question, without being specific about what to expect next, things go wrong. The world produces stuff. I mean, one might have assumed, as many did in Europe, that this would be in some sense an isolationist administration. It's not at all that. It might be very unilateralist, but it's not isolationist. It's in some ways very activist. You could even make the argument that Trump is in some ways a foreign policy president, for better or for worse. So things can happen. And in that context, even thinking about European security, it's one thing to say what has been said in the NSS, to plan for what is embodied in the authorization document and other things. But then stuff happens, whether it's in the Baltic or the Black Sea or elsewhere, and you can get into a kind of escalatory dynamic. And then you have real tests of how the US and European leaderships will respond. I think those are the key things to watch, frankly, as the surprises.
Yes, events have a way of causing trouble, and many other countries have a say in what happens next in the world. And this is always challenging for the implementation of strategy documents. Carrie, what do you expect next? And we have a policy next, and we have a lot of questions about this foreign and domestic overlap question. What is going to come next from the administration, both policy wise and merging that foreign and domestic or political agenda?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Next up from the administration policy wise is the National Defense Strategy. That's a huge document that, if the first Trump administration is any guide, will be a much more coherent and much longer lasting document. I'm reminded of when the 2017 National Security Strategy dropped. It was authored by then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who kind of spearheaded the process with Nadia Shadlow. Very much more traditionalist foreign policy document that reassured a lot of people about the so-called kind of quote unquote adults in the room during the first Trump administration. Um, and the moment John Bolton came into office as the National Security Advisor and H.R. McMaster had left, somebody asked him about the national security strategy, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I think that's in a drawer somewhere. We don't really look at it anymore." So these policy documents have shelf lives, depending on both events, right? It also should be noted that the Biden administration had to completely rewrite its national defense and national security strategy after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They had been planning on putting much less emphasis on Russia in that document and had to significantly revise it. So events on the ground can and will change administration security postures. And who's in office and who's in power at any given time will also change how relevant those documents are. What is different about the National Defense Strategy is that there tends to be more institutional memory, there tends to be less turnover. And so you tend to get much more effective and cogent implementation of these strategies. So, in contrast to the 2017 NSS and the first Trump administration, the 2017 National Defense Strategy was taken quite seriously within the Department of Defense. And I will tell you, as someone who was working in the DoD at the time, it was very difficult to get any priorities through anything if it was not couched in that language. So again, the National Defense Strategy is going to be a very important indicator of where the DoD is going to fall and where resources are going to go towards these different security priorities as outlined in the NSS. I saw a question in the Q&A about the NSS hemisphere, and so I wanna take that and answer it because I think it's a really important question and a very thoughtful one, right? For those kind of listening, the question is, to what extent is the NSS focus on the Western Hemisphere actually a homeland security issue with drugs and migration and terrorism, both kind of narco terrorism and now domestic terrorism that the administration is pointing to with the designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization? Versus the degree to which it's a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, a true Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that establishes spheres of influence. Here, I am going to be the pessimist in the room, and I think it's the worst of all worlds. And what I mean by that is that the militarization of US policy in the Western Hemisphere will almost certainly revolve around drugs, migration, terrorism, domestic political priorities. This is what we see happening in the Caribbean. It's what we see happening with the show around Venezuela because of the immigration issue with Venezuelan immigrants into the United States. It's what we see around the sort of like the US rhetoric around Mexico and what's going on in Mexico and the cartels there. It's all driven by domestic political priorities around drugs, around migration, immigrants inside the United States, right? We should not forget that we have National Guard forces deployed to half a dozen cities in the United States right now, supporting that are supposed to be supporting immigration operations. And so we're seeing the militarization of policy areas in the Western Hemisphere that have traditionally been thought of as civilian or law enforcement. And that is going to absolutely, in my opinion, play the dominant role in US policy towards the Western Hemisphere. However, the language is couched as a kind of spheres of influence, right? And you see this in the NSS with all of the paragraphs about sovereignty that, again, glibly might have been Chinese Communist Party talking points. And I think that's going to send a message to Russia in the much softer language on Russia, right? That will send a message to Russia and China that the United States is not so interested in playing roles in there and might be willing to cede the sphere of influence while not actually taking a lot of action around the Western Hemisphere to say, actively kick out the Chinese from South American economies, right? And taking those kind of concrete steps. And I say this again because for all of the policy and the rhetoric around the Western Hemisphere, the soybean crisis with regards to tariffs is a really interesting example of how one hand is not talking to the other, right? Where we implement all of these tariffs, China responds with retaliatory tariffs against US soybeans and now starts buying them from Argentina, further integrating their economies, right? And further entrenching the Chinese in South America and the South American kind of trade economy and that trade relationship, which runs at cross purposes to the stated goals of kind of Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. So So I do not think we're going to get a coherent, true Monroe Doctrine-like sphere of influence strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Instead, we're going to see a militarization of policy that deals with the domestic political priorities the administration cares about, but it's going to send a message that the US is not interested in China and Russia's sphere of influence. So I'm full of optimism about the Western Hemisphere right now.
I'm going to try to actually pull on that optimism strand or on a strand of what can Europe do next. Because and Phil, I'm going to go to you because you used a really interesting metaphor at the beginning of this, which is that the NDAA is a Christmas tree, and it's a Christmas tree of everything that Congress wants to put on it, but it's a Christmas tree of opportunities not only for Congress to get issues passed that have nothing to do with the defense space, but also an opportunity, and it presents openings to the Europeans. So, what do you see as that next step? Looking at opportunities that could be something that the Europeans pursue with the United States.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. Before I get to the land of opportunities in 2026, I'll take a short walk because how do you get there? And it's coming fast, and it's not necessarily going to be a months of opportunities in that sense in these wins. I would look if I were, at some of the pushback spaces in Congress. We already see a little bit. Kerry mentioned Venezuela. We see some Republican-led oversight of these issues. How does that relate to domestic feeling here in the U.S. about the pressure that the U.S. is putting on Venezuela, or the attention that we're putting abroad? I wouldn't go as far as just yet on Kerry's conclusion about not caring about Russia and China's spheres of influence just yet, and that's where the space for the next few months matter. Before I get to Europe, one more stop along the way. I would also look at emerging voices in the pushback. What sort of alternatives are presented or even thought about in the political miasma here in the U.S.? What sort of after the loss, what sort of democratic response or picture can they paint apart from affordability questions? But what does that mean for foreign policy questions in the trade world? Kerry alluded to some of that with tariffs and soybeans as well. In terms of Europeans, as much as I also some threw my hands up a little bit when reading some of the NSS. You have to see this as a place of opportunity. And now I'll put on my Poland hat, sitting in Warsaw, and maybe to answer Roland's question over there in the Q&A as well. Like how do you see this space with the civilizational language, with kind of a push to reconcile or somehow normalize relationship with Moscow, but yet you have Poland, a model ally sitting there, a wonderful economic story, an American story, really Polish American story as well, a NATO story, and a powerful player, a pusher in the EU. And I'm waiting for where's the European response, and maybe perhaps using some of those relationships that Warsaw tends to have. Not all of Warsaw, Roland, as you know, but parts of Warsaw has to kind of come together in a strategic matter and force action somehow onto the administration, regardless of some of the political wins that are happening here in DC. I think Poland's a good place to kind of be a messenger in that space. And Ian mentioned views on the EU here, but I think working together in that space quickly. Here in Washington could make a difference, and what does that mean? Actually, it could mean continuing supporting Ukraine movement, a creative movement on the use of Russian frozen assets, and continued political support for Ukraine, perhaps more from the EU angle with the temporary closed door to Ukraine on NATO. Thank you.
We have only a few more minutes, and I think that we have a range of questions that we haven't put under the buckets we've discussed so far. Ian, I'm going to put you on a spot here a little bit because we have questions on the Arctic, whether that matters at all. Maybe other people can jump in on that. I know this is not any of the three speakers' primary area of focus. We also have questions on the economic next step and anticipations of what is going to happen on European security as such. We talked about events. What is the likelihood of unwelcome events on the European continent now post these strategies? and again, some of these other regional issues, if you wanted to weigh in on the Arctic, for example.
Yeah. No, Christine, thanks very much. And forgive me for not looking at a lot of the questions because I'm on my phone, actually, believe it or not, which is great, but also makes it a little hard to not push the wrong button. So, look, on a couple of the things you mentioned, in the big picture, what to look at next. I mean, I do think clearly we're looking at a much stronger European pillar in NATO. I mean, I think there is a growing consensus that the EU is good at some things, command and control, interoperability, all of those kinds of things. That's not necessarily it. It can be very good at raising money for defense innovation and other things and new investment, and that will surely happen. But lodge it in NATO so that you take advantage of what's already there. I think that's a point of complete convergence across the Atlantic in terms of how to proceed. On the Arctic, I mean, I do think this gets us to this a little bit more to this question of what is existential and what is not. I think just a brief comment on that. I put myself slightly, I'm a little bit of a skeptic about the grand strategic competition in security terms in the Arctic and the idea that we're going to see a revolution in transport and all the rest of it. If you talk to people in the container industry, they're much less sanguine about the prospects for that. Is it hugely important to Russia in a different way, perhaps to China, to those who are actually in the Arctic themselves? Absolutely it is. Should the U.S. be paying more attention? Absolutely, we should. But what is the center of gravity? And that, I think, is the key point. I was very struck in our discussion, but also by reading these documents. This question, the existential versus the political, on this question of the Western Hemisphere. Issue number one in the agenda in this document, much less discussion about Russia or China in security terms. Is that existential? I mean, it's politically existential, maybe, but in terms of a new Monroe Doctrine, the United States is an unassailable security arbiter in the Western Hemisphere. We have no peer competitor, and we probably never will. Will people invest in things that we don't like? Maybe. Will they invest in ports or build infrastructure that we don't particularly like? Perhaps. But is anyone really going to challenge our control of the Panama Canal in security terms? Absolutely not. So, okay, I understand that as a political priority, but Russia, China, China, especially in some sense as a would-be peer competitor, this is where the existential center of gravity is for our planning. And hopefully we'll come back to that. And I think a lot of Europeans will be looking for that as well.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left. Carrie and Phil, 30 seconds each on the one thing that you would recommend to Europeans to do. Carrie.
Phil, you go first.
Easy. All right, thanks. No, I think on the NSS NDA, read the NSS, understand the NSS. It might take a little bit of understanding, taking a step into American shoes and into our culture a bit. Understand it, but use the NDAA. And so put the NSS aside and use the NDA and the opportunities there. And it's a long document. Control F, search for what is important for you in that space, and feel free to reach out to me as trying to work in a broad sense, but also in some of the more regional or smaller things that you may be important to you. There's a lot to work with regardless.
Carrie?
I would say don't dismiss the ideological language in the national security strategy. This is not a document and this is not a way of thinking that is going anywhere in the US administration anytime soon. And that is very much the frame of reference through which they think about what makes the United States safe. And when you think about it that way, it becomes a much clearer and actually more coherent document. I would also say expect more turbulence, that there is no one mind in this administration, and especially on economic policy. We got a couple of economic questions. There is absolutely no consensus within the administration from Congress about what even the powers of the president are in this realm, let alone what US policy should be. So expect a lot of back and forth and change in the economic sphere and a little bit more coherence in the security sphere.
Thank you three so much for your insights. As you can see, there are various perspectives, even across GMF, on what is going to be the thing that defines the future of this transatlantic relationship. But that is our strength. Because we have the 7 European offices, because we have deep insights across various perspectives in Washington, D.C., we're happy to bring to you different analytical angles and tips for what to follow to understand what the U.S. will do next and to help facilitate greater pathways in the future transatlantic relationship. We have a lot of analysis out about this. My colleague Maton has put it in the chat. We have analysis from many perspectives on the national security strategy. We have new analysis out of the NDAA, and we're going to continue providing this guidance and serving this explainer function as we see more policies drop, like the National Defense Strategy. Please follow us on all of our social media channels. Check in with us, send us your questions, and thank you so much for joining us this morning and for our team, Cross Strategic Convening, for making this possible so that we can work together to understand what is going on in the transatlantic relationship. See you next time.